Good morning. My name is Derek, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Fleet Safety 101 conference call. All lines have been placed on listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct an interactive question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question during that time, simply press star then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a tone acknowledging your request, and a prompt to record your name. If you would like to withdraw your question, please press star then the number 2. I would now like to turn the conference over to Ms. Kathleen O'Shaughnessy. You may begin.
Hello and welcome to Fleet Safety 101, today presented by Steve Bojan, Vice President of Transportation Risk Services at Hub International. Before we get started, I want to let everybody know that this presentation will be recorded and posted to our website at hubinternational.com, and also that the slides will be available. Regarding our presenter today, Steve Bojan has 18 years of experience in transportation and logistics, 5.5 of which is in the transportation safety role for a large insurance carrier, and has been with Hub since February 2012. He has many webinars that are available on demand on our website, and I encourage you, if you enjoy them today, to take advantage of them. And now, Steve.
Thank you, Kathleen. Today we're going to talk about fleet safety basics. And I think let's start with talking about some of the challenges for fleets and what I like to call opportunities to excel. There are really there's a few different types of fleets, and each of them have their own challenges. We have owned fleets, which are company purchased vehicles. We own the vehicles outright, often trucks, cars, trailers. Long-term leases where we get into a lease agreement, basically an owned vehicle, but just somebody else, we just pay monthly on it. And these, again, can include cars, vans, light trucks, heavy trucks, trailers. Sometimes we'll even put spotters and other industrial trucks on the road and we'll plate them. We also have hired vehicles where we'll hire somebody such as a distribution company or wholesaler to deliver to us, a service provider, somebody that will come out, a construction company maybe that comes out with a dump truck or something of the like, for hire carriers, a truckload, a trucking company. One of the big challenges here is we don't think we have an exposure, that we're outsourcing our risk. And depending on the level of interaction, the level of intertwined relationship, it increases that level of potential liability. One of the other things to remember here when we outsource transportation or outsource some fleets, service is a key area. Oftentimes we just think of getting rid of risk in terms of crashes, but what were to happen if they weren't to deliver our product on time, or if they were to damage it? That can be have a huge effect on our company. And then now let's move on to the non-owned side. This is an area where we don't often think about it. Maybe a little more in trucking we do, in heavy trucking, but we often don't think about this in terms of, for many organizations. We have owner-operators at many trucking companies. They're not owned, there's independent businessmen, but they are really part of the fleet, and we have a lot of responsibility for them because, well, they have our DOT number, and we're paying liability insurance for them. Employees that are paid for their vehicle use, monthly or by the mile. When they're driving for us, while usually their personal insurance will cover most crashes, the company's insurance serves as an umbrella. So we take that liability because the cost of crashes is increasing. Also, as for non-owned, sometimes we don't pay for an admin or even a security guard to go grab lunch or go to the bank. That's a non-owned we don't think about. And one of the big challenges we see from an insurance standpoint is rental cars. We'll have guys going all over the place, much as myself, where we rent a car in some other city, often in an unfamiliar environment. And while, again, that initial level of coverage may come under that employee's personal policy, it very quickly can come back to the company. So what are some of the results of unsafe driving? Crashes involving business vehicles can result in huge jury awards. Recently, there was a $58.5 million jury award in New Mexico that one of the jurors said, we're sending a message to the energy industry for this claim with this award. The actual cost of a claim can be 2 to 5 times as expensive as what's paid to claimants. It's kind of an iceberg model. We see the top part, which is what the insurance company pays, and then there's that part under the water we don't see. Think about the amount of time management spends being involved in a claim. The replacement cost, if you have to replace or rent a new vehicle, the cost of replacing a driver that's injured, those can be huge. Also, in motor vehicle crashes can lead to adverse publicity. I was reading about a loss the other day in Virginia where the media, the local newspaper, skewered a construction company in a asphalt tanker rollover, and it was really unfounded. They took some online data and extrapolated some very wild claims that weren't true. Also, we don't always think about the failed customer service. Let's say we're not, if we get in a crash, we're not able to make a delivery. We're not able to, repair some type of product. So we have that failed customer service. They may go somewhere else. That client may go somewhere else, or maybe may have some bad faith. And lastly, one of it's becoming more common is losing business to safer operations. If we're not safe, large and sophisticated clients are starting to look elsewhere for service providers. I see this especially in the energy industry, where their whole goal is to stay out of the media. They look at online safety data, and as part of an RFP, their vendors have to explain their safety programs to make sure that they're going to be safe on site. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of crash versus accident. The definition of an accident, according to Webster, is an unfortunate incident that happens unexpectedly and unintentionally, typically resulting in damage or injury. A crash, on the other hand, is a violent collision, typically of one moving object with another or with an obstacle. The reality is, when we say accident, something that happened by happenstance. It kind of just happened. When I listen to my son, oftentimes, it was an accident, Dad. Did you make a bad decision? Yes. Was that really an accident? A crash, on the other hand, there was somebody who made a bad decision. It may not have been your driver. It could have been another party on the road, but somebody made a bad decision. I would say in 995 out of every 1,000 vehicle collisions, it should be described as a crash. Changing this discussion from accident, changing the description from accident to crash really puts the focus on human decisions. Now let's kind of chat about some of the big internal challenges that fleets face today. First and foremost is finding good drivers. As many of us know, there's a driver shortage in the commercial motor vehicle market. Finding people with CDLs, it's easy to find people with CDLs. It's very difficult to find good drivers with CDLs. Also, it's becoming more and more difficult to find good employees, period, and those good employees are your safe drivers. Keeping good drivers is another huge challenge. Once you find them, you need to keep them. When you have a good driver, you know how good he is, and you know what he's going to do. When you're hiring somebody, it's always a crapshoot. You never really know, especially with fleets where you have your employees out on the road, and while they're in front of you, they're clean, they're neat, they're scrubbed. When they're out on the road, they're going to revert to their normal level of behavior outside of work. Maintaining equipment is a huge expense for many organizations. We also put for many fleets, especially light-duty fleets, we put a lot of responsibility on the driver to take care of those vehicles, and we have to worry about driver abuse. Another area that can be very challenging is finding good operations supervisors. Oftentimes, drivers leave because of how they're treated. Money may be a contributing factor, but that's not usually the final straw that causes somebody to walk out the door. It's how they were treated poorly by somebody or felt that they were given a lack of respect. It's really critical to have good supervisors that understand operations and know how to treat their drivers or often remote employees in an empathetic way. Management focus is often a problem. For many fleets, driving or operating of vehicles is not a core part of the business. Think about construction. We think about road paving. We think about the pavers. We think about building a bridge. We don't think about getting equipment and materials to and from the location as being a key part of the job, but yet it often is, and it can be very expensive. Another big challenge with management focus is there's often a tunnel vision on the P&L and customer service, not on safety and what are the real costs to make sure that this fleet runs effectively. Big area where I see a lot of challenges lately is using technology to its potential. A lot of fleets are purchasing telematics devices, vehicle tracking. They're doing tracking on a computer, seeing where timesheets where people are. But are they really using the information that's there in a meaningful way that can help to improve safety? And lastly, time. Time is a huge challenge for any fleet operator. There's only so much time in a day, and I haven't seen anybody who's in operations management with fleets who's got spare time to plan, to do some real strategic planning, to look ahead to the future without spending 10 to 12 hours a day at work. So that being able to focus on the fleet is a huge challenge. Now let's hit on some external challenges that maybe we have a lot less control over. First is government regulations. Recently, July 1st, government changed some of the hours of the government changed hours of service regulations for commercial vehicles so that drivers would have to take a half hour off after working make sure they had a half hour off within their first 8 hours on duty. Those rules were changed last week when there was an appeal, but still that had a profound impact on many non-traditional fleets, including construction and refuse. Also, there's local laws. So oftentimes, local municipalities like Cook County, Illinois, will put regulations in place that limit oversized vehicle and heavy haul. They may charge extra money, extra fees for operating in certain areas. On the flip side, in states like Texas, the government has put in place speed limits of 80 and 85 miles an hour on certain roads. Seems a little excessive to me. Lawsuits are a huge challenge for all fleets. The law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe seems to be opening up all over the country. There are plaintiff attorneys advertising everywhere. Were you involved in an auto or truck accident? Something we're always thinking about. Unfair competition is a big challenge. Other folks are skirting laws to get things done more cheaply than we are. One of the biggest challenges is our customers. Oftentimes they have unrealistic demands and may ask us to break rules to get their job done. Other drivers on the road is a big challenge. Our drivers and us are dependent on other people being safe for our vehicles not to be in accidents. Bad roads are a huge issue, especially in the north, where you can drive in states like Michigan or Illinois and the roads are just chewed up, have a huge impact on the way vehicles are operated and damage to tires and suspensions on trucks. Weather is another issue. Down south in Louisiana, they're constantly worried about hurricanes. In Texas last year, tornadoes tore apart a number of truck yards. And last but not least is insurance. Costs are headed up, and insurance carriers are placing additional requirements on fleet operators. So now that I've said all the bad news, let's look at some industry best practices that can help you to make sure your fleets are safe. The ANSI Z15.1 2012 standard has been put in place to give some guidance on how to operate to put in place safety procedures for motor fleets. It's really an excellent template for non-trucking fleets. Good across the United States. It really is good for any fleet in North America. It provides a lot of help in terms of setting up a program and putting some focus from management. It provides a really good outline. it doesn't address regulatory issues for commercial motor vehicles, but it really, wasn't meant for folks who are non-fleet experts. Key elements of the program are management, leadership, and administration. Who's responsible for what within the organization? The operational environment. Again, going back to where we talked before, how do we operate our vehicles and where's that focus? What are some minimum requirements for drivers? Maintaining your vehicles, and lastly, there's a lot of time spent on incident reporting and analysis. We're going to speak more specifically on each of these issues. Management expectations. Each level of employee needs to understand their role. Senior management needs to understand what it is that what they want out of their operations supervisors and how they act on the road. Obviously, they're role models for everyone else within the organization, and they should be setting a good example. One of the key things to remember for management and supervision is don't let exceptions become the rule. When we have company regulations and rules in place, we need to make sure that they're followed. Communicating safety expectations is another huge area. What is an acceptable level of performance? In terms of crashes, we want to talk about cost and frequency. Many fleet operators tie some level of management compensation to these metrics. Also for drivers, what are acceptable law violations? Speeding, following too closely, seatbelt use. At what point do we suspend driving privileges? Company policy observations and company policy violations and negative observations are two other key areas that we need to make sure where we're setting expectations for our drivers. Hiring is a key to the castle. There's no doubt. According to my former boss, or vice president of risk management at a big trucking company, 90% of fleet management, fleet safety is driver hiring, 2.5% is management, and 7.5% is luck. We need to establish minimum hiring requirements. They put in place controls because really we hire our problems. And most companies, most fleets don't have the capacity to fix or rehabilitate drivers. It also reinforces expectations to supervisors and employees. When we hire good people, they understand. If we make poor hiring decisions, it says to the employees that are already with the organization, we don't place a lot of value on what you do. It also sends an additional safety message to the entire company about what's important. We also need to understand the demands of the driving position and make sure our hiring requirements are appropriate. How much will the employee be driving? Is he going to be local, over the road? What types of vehicles will he be operating? What type of skill set is required to operate those vehicles? And do they need to have some special training or, what I'm looking for here, do they need to be physically capable of doing the task at hand? This can be especially important in tanker operations or flatbedding. Think about having to chain up a bulldozer or climbing on top of a tanker. You can't have somebody with really bad knees or who can't climb a ladder in these type of positions. Some key things to hiring, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, are doing pre-employment screening that includes looking at a motor vehicle record, an MVR, or in Canada, a driver abstract. And in a PSP, or in Canada, they also have, I don't remember what it's called at this moment, but data on road safety performance for commercial drivers. Lastly, for many of our guys who are driving larger or non-traditional vehicles, a road test is really important. We'll talk about this again a little further in a few minutes, but just because somebody has a license does not mean that they're a good driver. Strong fleet policy. It sets as a baseline of knowledge. When you have a discussion with somebody who has a crash or a policy violation, it allows you a place to go to talk about specific language as to what they did wrong and areas where they can improve. It also talks about vehicle use. You want to have in there about vehicle use requirements. Who's allowed to drive what and when? This can be especially important for light-duty fleets where personal use can be an issue. You should have a distracted driving policy, which is really important, and again, we'll discuss a little further in a couple of minutes. Safety regulations we want to put in our policy include speed, maximum speed, convoy restrictions. I see this a lot in buses and refuse fleet and construction. Do we want to allow people to follow each other? And if so, what distance should they keep? Just think about if one of your vehicles were to get involved in a crash and then everybody were just following them closely, every one of them would be involved in that same crash, just like you see the clowns at a circus. Is that what we want to have on the road? Probably not. Within this policy, we also want to have some instructions on safe driving. That'll include defensive driving, how to drive in inclement weather, what do we consider to be acceptable following distance. Talk about ongoing training. What are some of the requirements of the organization for your drivers in ongoing training? Do they have to attend quarterly, monthly, annual safety meetings? Is there some online or other training that they need to do to keep their ability to drive your vehicles? And also talk about here that MVR and crash criteria. Explain what the requirements are so that your employees know that you have now know what they can and can't do and when when they will lose their driving privileges if they have violations. You also want to have in there crash reporting and investigation. We should be spending a lot of time on this training, but this allows your employee to look at some written documents to remind them of what they need to do in what are often some very stressful situations. Lastly, I have on here putting in their vehicle selection and maintenance. What are the requirements for your vehicles to be maintained? And this is really not so much for commercial truck fleets, but if you have a light-duty or service fleet where you have your drivers take those vehicles home, oftentimes we'll tell these employees, go get an oil change and turn in a receipt or use your company credit card for maintenance. Talking about maintenance intervals, where vehicles should go for repairs can be really important. Acceptable driver list. Who is allowed to drive what? Too often, we just throw keys at people with little thought about whether they even have a license. It's important when we're giving somebody the ability to drive our vehicle, and as we talked about before, there's a huge amount of liability going on here. Do they have the experience, the training, and at times the maturity to drive a vehicle for us? Make sure they have the appropriate license and endorsement. If it's a commercial vehicle over 10,000, they're going to need to have a medical card. If it's a CDL, if it's over 26,000, they need to have a commercial motor vehicle. They need to have a commercial driver's license, and depending on the type of vehicle, they may need to have special endorsements for tanker, hazmat, or passengers. Within the list, we also want to give consideration to moving violations and place possibly restrictions on folks who've had DUIs or other types of violations that can be potentially damning in case of some type of litigation. Non-owned is another area where we got to think about driver lists. How often, again, have we said to somebody in the office, why don't you just go and pick this up on your way home or go to the post office and get stamps? Do we want to let that person take their personal vehicle? The acceptable driver list does two things. It tells us who can drive their own vehicle, and two, it forces organizations maybe to limit the personal use of vehicles. One other thing that I didn't mention was when we talk about acceptable driver lists, oftentimes on light-duty vehicles or cars, if we let our drivers use those vehicles for personal use at home, do we let the spouse use that vehicle? And are we checking on the spouse's MVR and saying, is that person, the spouse or their child, allowed to use that vehicle? Distracted driving. This has been a really big issue for the last 4 or 5 years, and every fleet at this point needs to have a distracted driving policy. If you don't, you're really setting yourself up to a problem if there's ever a serious crash. Every plaintiff attorney will ask for this policy right away when they file their lawsuit. And it's important to remember risks go beyond just cell phones. Eating, drinking, adjusting the radio, talking to passengers, applying makeup, reading a map, some people shaving for men. These are huge risks. Many of the worst crashes I've seen were involved a driver who just looked down and said, I was reaching for my coffee and I looked up, traffic was stopped. It's important to remember to have a good policy in place. Talk about texting and radio use. Understand the risks from a management and driver perspective. If we talk about a distracted policy where cell phone use is limited or not allowed at all, we can't have our supervisors calling our drivers out on the road and saying, why didn't you answer my call when I told you to switch your route, when I was telling you to switch your route? They need to buy into the whole program. And then your drivers need to know how distracted driving affects them. Again, talked about some of these distractions, eating, drinking, and the radio. Passengers, common things we do every day on the road, don't even include the cell phone. One of the important things to remember is we don't see with our eyes, we see with our mind. And if we're engaged in other activities, that's some concentration power that's not focusing on the roadway. And I think the key here, the other key, enforce your policy. It does no good to have a policy if you're not going to enforce it. It just sends a bad message, and again, exceptions will become the rule. Government regulations. We need to follow them and know what they are. For commercial motor vehicles, it can be very confusing for non-truckers. It's not, these regulations were really created for over-the-road fleets, not for the construction company or, service provider that really only has a few vehicles or doesn't go out on the road, doesn't go over the interstate. Know what's required of your vehicles. Make sure that these rules are being followed. They're great safety tools. Registration and taxes are another huge issue. Your vehicles need to be plated for the weight that they're carrying, and if you're going across state lines. Big issue here is understanding the difference between inter and intrastate. I often equate these with being pregnant. You are or you're not. There is no gray area. If you go across a state line, you are an interstate carrier. If you don't, you can be intrastate. It's important to remember this when looking to plate your vehicles again, getting a DOT number, and also from an intra versus inter, some states have more lenient regulations on intrastate operators. Hazardous materials. Think about what you're hauling and the quantities. For flammables such as gasoline or diesel fuel, if you are under 119 gallons, it's considered for use and not a placarded amount. And then lastly, remember the local regulations. This can be especially important with bridge laws, boulevards that don't allow commercial vehicles or have very specific weight limits, and vehicle heights. Remember what happened in Seattle a couple of months ago where that tractor trailer hit the bridge and took it out on the I-5. Think about what the local regulations are. MVRs. I've mentioned this now 3 or 4 times, and you can't discount the value of running an MVR. People don't change, unfortunately, when they get behind the wheel. The MVR gives you a history of that person's safety performance for the last 3, 5, or 7 years. In Canada, this would be called the driver abstract. The MVR is a motor vehicle record, and it's ordered from the Secretary of State's office. There is a huge correlation to MVR performance or lack of violations and crash involvement. Establish and communicate acceptable MVR criteria. I often tell drivers in meetings, it's critical to protect your MVR. People will look at it. If you're involved in a crash, it's one of the first things, again, that a plaintiff attorney will request. Some sample guidelines include 3 or fewer minor violations in the last 36 months, 1 minor violation and 1 crash. Notice I have accident. It really should say crash on here. 2 crashes and no other violations of any type, or 1 major violation and no other violations. We also need to really take into account DUIs. What's an acceptable level? Ideally none, but depending on where you live. I'm from Wisconsin, where driving under the influence seems to be kind of a recreational habit, and it's not acceptable. I even saw an MVR once at a client where they had 8 DUIs, and they were still at a driver's license. Figure out what's acceptable to the company, what's an acceptable risk, and what's an acceptable type of employee. Really, the reality is, folks who get serious violations in a car, is that the type of employee you want working for you? Driver observations. They can be they're regularly scheduled. They can be in cab where you're with the driver, in a car compartment also, or covert, where you follow somebody secretly or maybe even stand behind some bushes and see how they operate the vehicle. This is a powerful tool and allows you to provide feedback to the driver, and it's important that you provide good and bad feedback. If they're doing all the right things, let your driver know, and also tell them how he could improve. Sometimes people don't think about good habits like using turn signals, making sure their seatbelt is always on, or that their load is secured properly. Using citizen complaints can be huge. People don't call in unless they're really upset, and in general the driver's done something egregious. 2 other areas are peer feedback. Oftentimes teammates will let supervisors and management know if there's somebody who's not being safe on their team. And we often recommend for lighter duty fleets using 1-800-HOW'S-MY-DRIVING stickers on the back of the car. This allows citizens an easy way to call in and for you to manage the program without too much effort. In all of these cases, a key part is timeliness. If there's a positive and or a negative observation, within 24 hours or 1 business day, you should get with that driver. That way you can talk about the specifics of the observation and what can be done to improve it. Waiting a week or a month, people forget what happened. Telematics, a way to remotely observe track driver behavior. These fleet tracking devices have become much more common in recent years and come down considerably in cost. There's a number of different data focuses depending on the type of device that you purchase. Some involve video, where there's a camera facing the front out towards the front of the vehicle and another facing the driver. Other systems focus on geographical tracking, where the vehicle is and or breadcrumbing, sometimes using geofencing. Most systems today track speed. Some track what I call here movement outliers, hard braking incidents, rapid acceleration, shifting to the side. These systems use an accelerometer, which is much like a gyroscope. If it's upset, it will send a message. Vehicle inspections. A number of these systems allow you to track the daily vehicle inspections and send the data electronically to the home office. So instead of handing in a paper DVIR, daily vehicle inspection report, the driver will put it into the computer and it will tell maintenance of any deficiencies. Another key thing today in some of these telematics systems is tracking of vehicle systems. The sophisticated ones will tell the home office if there's a system that's failing, if an oil change is needed, or even if the driver has a seatbelt on. Usually this information is transmitted by cell or satellite. Key parts to any telematics system are, when it's rolled out, explain the how and the why to your drivers. Also talk to them about what you're tracking and have some rules in place on what are acceptable levels. For hard braking, if you're in a city like Chicago, a local driver may have 3 or 4 hard braking incidents in a day just because of traffic and these crazy bicycle riders we have around here. if you're running over the road on Interstate 80 between Iowa and Nebraska, you probably shouldn't have any hard braking incidents in a day. Having these different acceptable levels is really important, and it leads to more acceptance by your drivers. Another key part of this is really sitting down and talking with your drivers about any incidents or outliers quickly after they occurred. I worked with a aggregate hauler in the Midwest. They put a telematics system in this past year, and at first the fleet manager was talking to drivers daily about hard braking and speeding incidents, and within 3 or 4 weeks, the 50 or 60 drivers in his fleet decided they were tired of talking to their manager at the end of every day. So he's now down to 1 or 2 discussions every other week. They've seen their losses come down dramatically, and their customer service is picked up. One other key part of any telematics system, it's important that you integrate it with operations. What this aggregate hauler did is they used it with their dispatch system so that they're able to respond to customers more quickly. What it's done is it's allowed everyone in operations to spend time on the system, and they pay attention to what's going on. Training. There's some key parts here. Onboarding, not just throwing keys at a driver of a tractor trailer or even a box truck. Explain to them what are your expectations, how to safely drive your vehicle. Are there any specific systems or issues with the type of vehicle that they need to be careful on? What we see with, small box trucks in the 15 to 20,000 pound range is they tend to be very top heavy, and they almost drive like a car, but they don't stop like a car. For other types of trucks, we have to talk about, again, being top heavy, that it's much harder to stop an empty truck than it is a full loaded truck. And what do you expect them to do as part of the pre- and post-trip inspection process? Remedial training, post-crash or for serious safety violations. What are you going to do with these guys? How are we going to correct their obvious flaws, their poor behaviors? Having a plan in place can be huge ahead of time, and have some training lined up. And one of the big challenges is I often hear, well, we're just going to make them watch some videos. If you make them watch videos, are you going to discuss those videos? Are you going to make them take a knowledge check to make sure that they retain some information from what they just saw? Toolbox talks are especially popular with local fleets and construction fleets, where a safety supervisor or operations manager will spend some time, maybe once or twice a week or every other week, talking about specific safety issues for 10 or 15 minutes. Some good topics are weather, seasonality, some recent crashes and what we're seeing on the road. Also talk about, following distance. Load securement is huge. How should a load be properly secured? What some other companies are doing in the area. Structured safety meetings do an excellent job of sending a message of a safety-based culture to the entire organization. They tell everybody that safety is really important, that the company has made a huge investment of time and money into educating the employees on safety-related information. Another way to train employees on safety is to use self-paced or self-administered training. Oftentimes this is online, or it could involve videos in the office. Again, this is a great program, but it's important to have some form of human aspect at some point. Otherwise, my personal experience has been when we do online training, if we're doing it at home, we'll do it at night at some point when we have a free hour or two, and maybe we don't have a lot of retention. One of the most important and key pluses to online training is I have now taken harassment training probably 7 or 8 times online, usually on a Saturday night at midnight. And while I can't tell you about the key concepts, I can tell you that harassment is a critical issue to every organization that I've been a part of. And this really sends that important message. Equipment and maintenance, another area that often gets overlooked, but is a huge part of any safety program. Vehicles need to be appropriate for the job. We don't want vehicles overloaded, over capacity, things hanging off the back, something that's really not going to work. We don't want to put 15 passengers in a Suburban. Make sure the vehicle is appropriate for the job. Also, we don't want to send out a semi into downtown Chicago with a 4-foot crate on the back of it. Make sure the age of the fleet and its condition depends on sphere of control. What I mean by this, if you have an over-the-road fleet, it needs to be newer because it's harder to really maintain it and observe it for any type of maintenance issues. If you're going to see the vehicles every day, they can be a little older and they can have a little more aches and pains. Strong preventative maintenance should be in place. A PM program is a critical part of any fleet program. Make sure your vehicles are maintained. One, it extends the life of the vehicle, and two, it puts a set of eyes on all of your critical safety systems, your brakes, your tires, your hydraulic hoses on a regular basis so that they can identify any potential failures before they become a huge problem out on the road. Another thing to think about when we're speccing equipment is original equipment manufacturer safety systems. These are becoming especially popular on heavy-duty trucks and also on your more expensive passenger vehicles. These include adaptive cruise control, lane departure warning systems, vehicle stability control. What these do is they take some of the decisions out of the driver's hands. And if something were to happen to your driver, whether he were to become incapacitated or lose some concentration momentarily, they would hopefully snap him back into place. Adaptive cruise control, what that does is if you're using cruise and there's a forward viewing radar out the front of the vehicle, and it will slow your truck down if you get too close to the vehicle in front of you. Stability control will stop the driver from rolling a truck if he's going too fast around a curve. And one of the other things to remember here is a non-owned auto does not equal not my problem. When you have non-owned autos, it's a good idea to make sure to have your employees submit a vehicle inspection report weekly, monthly, or at least quarterly as to what the condition of their vehicle. Two reasons. One, we want to make sure the vehicle is safe to drive, and two, we want to make sure that it presents a good image for the company if they're going out to our customers. Incident and crash management. I often ask when I visit clients, when I do driver meetings, what's the first rule of transportation? If you were to ask me, it's when you have a problem, call your dispatcher. We need to really educate our driver. There is no situation where when you come into contact with another object or vehicle where you should not be contacting dispatch almost immediately, right after you check on the condition of the other parties, contact 911, then call your dispatcher or supervisor. They can't help your driver if they don't know what's going on. A key part of this is having a plan in place. You need to have an incident or crash management plan and educate your drivers to it prior to the incident happening. Know who's responsible, what needs to be done, and how you want to handle the situation. Everyone needs to be trained on this plan. When do incidents need to be sent to a higher level? When do we need to get senior management, possibly the insurance company or your insurance broker involved so as to manage this before the crash manages you? Or the media. We want to make sure that we educate our driver on who and how to talk to other parties involved. And by having key facilitators designated, those folks are going to be the ones that handle the critical crashes. They'll understand how to deal with the media, how to engage an attorney, and how to get, like I said, get other outside agencies involved. A key part of any crash program is doing a post-crash investigation to understand what happened. Identify causation and underlying issues, what I often call is a root cause analysis. When somebody hits a deer, we often say, well, he just hit a deer. Was he driving at dusk on a road that has a lot of deer, where maybe we should have educated him ahead of time? Or was there a situation where one of our drivers rolled a truck full of appliances because it wasn't loaded properly, or it was his first time out, and when you look at his MVR and his application, he just really wasn't a good fit for this job. The other part of this is taking remedial action and or disciplinary action. Make sure that when you have a crash, you're not going to have the same guy repeating it over and over. One company I worked with, one recycling company, the same driver rolled a truck 3 times. I looked at them and said, do you realize that this guy has cost you or your insurance carrier, depending on how you want to look at it, over $250,000 in the last couple of years? At that point, it kind of changed their perspective. It's important to make sure that you're taking this remedial action, but think about the severity of the incident when you do this. Some final thoughts. Management needs to act if you're aware of an issue. Not knowing and saying to folks, I'm not going to track critical safety data because I don't want to know is not a valid excuse. Use all the tools that are available to you, including the MVR, if you have the potential for telematics, driver observations, look at that application, get a full view of who you're going to put behind the wheel of your vehicle. In many cases, this is the riskiest thing that an employee at your company does. Address positive and negative behaviors. And engage field personnel. I think that's a huge part that we often overlook. When we have a safety manager, say the safety manager is responsible for safety, he could be at the home office, and if you have 4 or 5 remote sites, you need to engage those field personnel who see your drivers on a regular basis. For a final thought, fleets often pose some of the most challenging and dangerous aspects of operations. Not recognizing the level of risk and implementing controls can put the entire organization at risk. When I started our presentation today, I talked about that $58.5 million judgment against a tanker operation in New Mexico. $47.5 million of that was punitive, which means that that's uninsurable. That can really put a damper on an organization and put many small to medium-sized businesses out of business. I appreciate your time very much, and we're now open to questions.
Operator?
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, please press star, then the number 2 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster.
While we wait for online, I have some online questions as well.
And then as we're waiting for a couple of questions, just want to remind everybody there's 2 upcoming webinars. One is on driver wellness next week, and in September we will be having a webinar on cargo and vehicle theft, consequences in preventing these type of issues. Real quickly, want to mention about Hub International. We're headquartered in Chicago. We're the 10th largest global broker. We have more than 300 locations within North America, Puerto Rico, and Brazil, and over 6,500 employees. Within the Risk Services Group, we have close to 40 safety professionals that specialize in a multitude of safety areas, including regulatory compliance, ergonomics, fleet safety, security, and claims management. Some questions, please.
All right. So our first online question that we had was, what do you do when senior managers don't follow your policies, such as a senior executive with a company car entertaining clients and under the influence?
It's a very tough situation. At the very least, you should probably educate them without being confrontational about company policies and what exposure that places on the organization. I see it often, where I see this more common is here, but also with distracted driving, texting while driving, explaining to the driver, talking about them from a driver's standpoint, what is acceptable behavior. And I think there's one other thing to do here, and that's have a good fleet policy in place. When you have a strong fleet policy, you can go to that policy and explain what's acceptable behavior. When you don't have a policy, it's very hard to deal with these kind of people. I think really kind of talking about it in terms of just safety generalities and, kind of going over the fleet policy with them, re-educating them without being challenging or difficult is a way to handle this.
Another question, at what point is an organization considered as having a fleet, and how should that affect conversations with their insurer? And also related to that is Hub International have a fleet risk?
Hub International definitely has a fleet risk. We have at least 1,000 employees driving around the country in their own vehicles. I consider that a pretty large fleet risk. Beyond that, even if you have one vehicle, you have fleet risk. Once you get to 4 or 5, I think it's time that you start talking to your insurance company about this. That's in personal vehicles. Anytime you have a delivery or service vehicle that's out on the road regularly, you probably want to talk with your insurance carrier about that. Even one vehicle poses a huge exposure to the organization, and it's really important that you understand what controls you should have in place. Often when I visit with clients, I start talking about the regulatory requirements. I end my discussion saying, you realize the worst things that can happen is not the DOT or OSHA walking in the door. It's a crash and not having anything in place so that when a plaintiff attorney asks, where's your safety program, how did you screen this driver, and you give a blank stare in a deposition. It really is important that you have in place a good program because, one, it protects the company from liability, and probably more important, it protects your driver from getting injured at work. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing is that our employees leave work in the same or better condition than they started out their day.
Thank you. Next question. How can you get employees to be educated on issues such as seatbelt policy without becoming confrontational? We believe in the use of seatbelts and want our employees to use them.
Well, I think seatbelts that's what we should first do is say seatbelts are the law. And for any company, I think one of the first tenets is that we're law-abiding. So that's where I'd start with. The second place is to talk to your employees about the fact that there is no more important safety system in a vehicle than a seatbelt. When we hear about fatalities on the road, the most common sentence that comes after somebody killed in a crash is they were ejected from the vehicle. You're not ejected if you're wearing your seatbelt. It was common for drivers to say 10 and 20 years ago, I don't want to wear my seatbelt in case I need to escape the vehicle. Vehicles are built today to serve as a cocoon around you if there's a crash. Wearing a seatbelt is critical.
Next question. How can you discuss telematics with drivers who object to being covertly observed or spied upon?
I think there's a couple things to do here. One, don't make it covert. Explain what you're doing ahead of time so it's overt. They know that they're being monitored. Second, explain the benefits to the company and to the driver. They're being monitored so that you have additional chances for operational excellence. Beyond that, a good telematics system not only tells us what the driver's doing for performance, but also tells us what the driver's doing so that we can protect the driver if there's a complaint or a crash. A good example that I heard this week was a citizen called in a complaint to a fleet of service vehicles, and the driver said he wasn't there when confronted on this issue, or just when this issue was discussed. They went to the telematics system and determined the driver was 20 miles away from where this person said he was. So that can diffuse it. The same in crash situations where two cars may be involved in a crash and the other party says your driver was speeding. A good telematics system can tell you the speed of your driver just prior to the crash. A video system is going to tell you the actions that your driver and the other party were taking. This can be especially important in a he said, or he said, she said situation, and that happens often in intersection crashes. I think what we find with telematics system is there's a lot of resistance for the first 3 or 4 weeks, and once we get past that and we can show that there's some benefits to the system, drivers really start to like it.
Great. Last question we have online is, will we have a copy of this available? Will this information be available for printing to keep for future reference? I can say the recording is going to be on the website. The slides will be as well. I also want to encourage you, when you're on the Hub International website, to subscribe to our Hub Connects to Personal Insurance or to Commercial and Business Insurance newsletter. This newsletter frequently has articles written by Steve on issues related to risk in terms of fleet-related risk. There's also other business insurance issues that you may find of interest. And there are also regular risk bulletins that are available. So if you enjoyed this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to, after the fact, when you receive this announcement that the recording is up, you'll get a chance to register for our newsletter, and we hope you do so.
If you have any additional questions, you can contact your local Hub representative, and he can get with me or another member of the risk services team to assist you with any additional questions and or service that you may need.
Yep, and we just put Steve's email address up, so flood him with questions. He loves that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to being on the next webinar with many of you again.
And that is all. We hope to see you again in our next webinar, which is Driver Wellness for Commercial Fleets on August 13th.
Thank you for your participation in today's conference call. You may now disconnect.